Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever it is, wherever you are. My name's Ali Amagasu, and you're listening to Cloud Unfiltered. Today, we've got a special episode for a number of reasons, one of which is that I have a new co-host that I'm really excited about. His name is Pete Johnson. He works for Cisco. He knows a lot of stuff, and he has a wild herd of Chihuahuas apparently loose somewhere in his home right now. So he claims to have them, he claims to have them under control. We'll see. But Pete, can you tell the audience a little bit about what you've done in the past, what you do for Cisco now, and that would be great.
Well, yeah, so you might remember me. I actually looked this up. It was episode 36 that I was a guest on, so I'm happy to be back in a co-host capacity, so thanks for having me. And yeah, so I, strictly speaking, I'm a technical solutions architect in Cisco's global partner organization. And what that means is on the cloud products that we have in the Cisco portfolio, like CCP and Cloud Center and some of those things, I'm responsible for partner enablement. So teaching partners, the Cisco ecosystem of resellers that we sell a ridiculously large percentage of our product through, I bring them up to speed on what these products are, what the benefits are to their customers, and what the best selling motions are for them. You know you have done a good job as guest when you get invited to be a co-host. That's all I gotta say. Right? Well, hopefully you won't regret that, and hopefully, you know, my first suggestion for guests that takes us in a slightly different, but I think interesting direction, we won't regret any of that.
Wow, there's some pressure on you there, Anoj. All right, then I'll go ahead and introduce our first guest. Well, not our first guest, but our main guest today, Anoj Willy. He is the CEO of Zen Tours. Welcome, Anoj.
Hi, Ali. Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Thank you for being on the show. We talked a little bit before, and I think you have a very interesting path as to how you or why you went ahead and started the company that you're running right now. Can you give us a little bit of background about why Zen Tours?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, let me echo what Pete said. You probably will actually regret some of this podcast, but I think that's part of the fun. So I came from the development background. I then I got into networking and sort of the infrastructure side, and found myself working for a venture capital firm called Nantworks out in LA. Founded by this real visionary named Patrick Soon-Shiong, was really changing the way we were delivering healthcare in the United States. He was actually ranked by Forbes as world's wealthiest American in healthcare. So sometimes I joke and I say Patrick got confused one day and he hired me thinking I could help him. But when I went over there, I ran cloud and high performance computing, and it was one of the first private cloud builds, I would say, for kind of a major US enterprise. And learned a lot from there. And one of the things, it was not just kind of running cloud for these different business units, of which we had about 30 or 40, doing anything from genomics to drug discovery, pharmaceutical workloads. But we also had a venture capital side for which I did diligence. And one of the experiences I had was just saw a lot of different product companies come through looking for funding, and really seeing what VCs looked at before they funded a company. And so learned a lot about that. A lot of my background comes from product development, and looked to start a product from there, but realized, saw a lot of these companies actually fail as they were getting investment. And over 80% of the companies that you would put investment in, typically fail or don't yield the return. And that's a typical number from any VC portfolio. And when you really sit down and ask the question why, it came down to this one answer, which was sales execution, right? So if you look at how a company starts up, you usually get a bunch of tech founders. They're smart. They come to a VC and they say, "Hey, I've got a great idea for a product." VC says, "Great, here's your seed round, 3 to 500K. They come back and they say, "Look, I've got a product." VC says, "Well, that's not really a product. I still have to download it and compile it myself. Here's your round A, 3 to 5 million. Come back when you got a product and a couple of customers." And they do that, and then the VC says, "Great, you've got a couple of customers. Now you've got to scale to take the TAM, the total addressable market, because if you don't, someone else will enter that market and confuse that," right? We're actually seeing that right now with the container market, right? Docker was first in there, had a tremendous amount of market share and mind share, really, but because they haven't quite succeeded in taking the total addressable market. Now you're seeing other players enter, Kubernetes, Mesosphere, et cetera. And now that's sort of confusing the TAM. So where maybe 2 years ago, a customer would have said, "Hey, I'm going containers. I'm most likely going Docker, now they're stepping back and they're saying, well, maybe I'll try Kubernetes or Docker or both, right? And so it's this sales execution risk, which we call kind of that round B. That's where we see kind of most companies fail. And that was really interesting to me. And so while I wanted to start a product company, I knew that, hey, if I entered into the market and I said, hey, I've got yet another new product for DevOps, a CIO would say, well, gosh, join the line. I've got 30 other people trying to pitch me this product, right? What was really missing in the market was the ability to kind of go and attack the actual outcome. So if I'm a CIO, I'm coming into a new company, I'm not saying, hey, Ali, let's go build the best, biggest Exchange environment anybody's ever seen, right? It's like, no, I don't need that. Office 365, I've solved my problem. That's an email problem, though. We know that problem. It's been solved for 30 years. What they really want to do, though, is take that sort of method or get that outcome for cloud or DevOps, but it's not that easy because today I've got to go out and buy a bunch of products, and I got to consult with a number of different companies or vendors, and then it's on me to sort of try to put that and mesh that together, right? And so that's one of the bigger failure patterns we see as customers try to go to cloud and try to embrace this.
Interesting. Hey, Pete, before you ask a question, I'm going to interrupt you for a sec, Anoj, and say your headphones, for whatever reason, when the cord is hitting your laptop or whatever before, it's picking it up, actually, the audio. So,
oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So I don't want you to have to stop moving. So maybe you just grab the headphone cord with your hand or something to kind of stop it from shaking around.
Got it.
It's just creating a little bit of, I assume you're hearing it as well, Pete.
Yeah, there's that regret that we already warned people about. Right? I heard a little bit too, but it didn't get in the way for me of all the smart things Anoj just said.
I know, that's why I didn't stop him. I didn't want to stop him. So Anoj, thank you for explaining. I appreciate you telling us how you got to this point where you started Zen Tours. So what are you guys doing? Do you have, how long has the company been around, and what are you doing?
Yeah, great. So company's been around for about 2 years. Our strength is, and what we do is we're a consulting shop, so we don't resell, we don't sell any product. We consult with customers to help them build and realize their initiatives, whether they're in cloud, DevOps, or big data. And while those are our strengths, one of our differentiators is not only do we do this directly with customers and clients, we actually help VARs, so the reseller community, also build up their own capabilities around those practices in DevOps, cloud, and big data. So we have a recipe that we sort of take customers through, which leads to successful initiatives. But on top of that, we also help enable a teach you how to fish model with VARs, so they can also figure out how to enter this market and be relevant there.
Nice. You're the second person I've spoken to recently who's talked about the teach them how to fish model. That there's a lot of consultancies or even professional services organizations out of larger companies that will send folks to sit, on premises and actually help teams run things, but that often they walk away and the team is not equipped to run things.
Yeah, that's right, and that's one of the reasons why we saw this. So when I left that venture capital firm, I went to go work at a VAR, right? Because I realized, hey, if sales execution is a problem, who has really solved and who understands sales execution? And when you look around, a lot of times there's this notion in the channel where oh, wow, you're going to go work for a VAR, insert finger in mouth. And I think that's very unfair because, we look at the channel and we say, oh, they're not involving, they're not moving forward. But what we don't realize is a channel has spent a tremendous amount of time figuring out how to get into customer environments, how to understand really what a customer wants and how they want to purchase. And so there's value there. And that's the reason why folks like Cisco and Microsoft have these large channels, right? What the channel struggles with, though, is trying to build something new, right? So a channel is used to reselling. They're used to being fed, hey, here's a product. This product will solve this problem, right? But now we're at this point where it's so complex that, gone are the days where an Oracle can walk in and say, hey, I've got your entire data strategy, right? It actually requires an ecosystem of players in terms of technology, as well as a vision and an ability to execute that across kind of a complex landscape within the customer in order to drive success, right? And you'll hear me use these analogies, but I use the Lego analogy. We've all bought Lego before. There's a nice picture on the front of a Lego box, but you open it up and it's a bunch of pieces, right? luckily for us, there's a guidebook in there that's telling you how to put those pieces together. So the pieces right now are all these different vendor pieces. And what's missing for a customer is this digital guidebook to put all those pieces together in a way that says, yes, that's that picture I wanted in the front. And so this is really what we provide customers. It's that digital Lego manual.
And that Lego analogy is spot on, because I mean, if you look at how IT organizations are built today, like the number of vendors and the number of point products stitched together, literally a Lego box is worth.
Right,
So,
exactly.
Pete, I've been hogging the conversation. What kind of questions do you have for Anoj?
Yeah, I've got a lot of questions for Anoj. So one of the reasons, Anoj, I wanted to have you on, if you look at the other guests we've had on the program, it's been typically product guys, or it's been analyst guys who were trying to point out whether the product guys are doing a good job or not. But you've been on both sides, both the having to do it and having to help others do it, both sides of the cloud adoption mechanic. So what I wanted to ask you most of all was, what is a typical enterprise adoption for some kind of public or private or mix cloud environment look like? And what are the things that they typically trip over?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say, I talk about the cloud journey in two facets. So one is what I call the short-term decisions and the long-term decisions. So we get wrapped around a lot of things like product, of course, right? Like, hey, what am I using underneath in terms of infrastructure? Is it Hyperflex? Is it some kind of hyperconverged? Are there SANs or NFS, NAS, storage, compute, all of that? And then on top of that, we also get wrapped around, cloud management platforms like, right. Is it, Cloud Center or the other ones out there, or is it AWS, or is it Azure, and who am I using? And yes, those decisions are important, but the more long-term decisions are what I call architecture and the user experience, right? So let's talk about architecture for a second. Look, I could sell you different storage manufacturing from Pure, from NetApp, from EMC, and I'm not one or the other. And they all typically do a similar thing, right? And they're easy to swap one for another. But if I came and I said, hey, Pete, you've got to change your entire database architecture and rewrite all your schemas, that's a much bigger problem, yes. Right? And so that architectural decision is a very kind of long-term decision. I know we talk Agile. Agile is awesome. It's a phenomenal methodology, but Agile is not for everything. So for instance, if I'm going to assume you guys are in a building somewhere, right? Taking this call. And when they put that building together, somebody didn't build a room and say, oh, Pete, let's go iterate on this next room and see what happens. That whole thing was planned, right? And it has to be, because that's how buildings have to get built. So the architecture side is a long-term decision, and that generally has to be sort of planned out. So that's one place that people get tripped up, because to come back and to re-architect something, it's hard. You can't change the foundation of a building, right? You almost have to tear the whole thing down and build it up again.
Right.
The second big thing is the experience. A lot of people kind of forego this because they think, hey, I'm thinking in terms of a product, or I'm thinking in terms of AWS or Azure, and which should I go into? You really have to think about the experience to the user, right? So, just think about this front end thing. I could give you an iPhone. I could give you an Android phone. Both of them do the same thing. I can text. I can send email, watch videos. But the user experience is very different. And you switch one for another, and you cause almost like, this is why you have people who are so into Apple phones or so into Android phones, is because they have figured out this is the experience they want. And if you look at it, this is what Amazon figured out. Amazon said, hey, I launched the service S3. 4 years later, they launched the service EC2. But in that 4 years, they figured out, what kind of user experience do we want? Oh, it's developers who are using our stuff. They need, they don't want pretty GUIs. They need better CLIs. They need better APIs to hit this. They need console access, right? How do we do billing? How do we do reconciliation? Once they figured out that experience, then they could increase the velocity of their services. Now you see Amazon push out a service every 2 to 3 months, right? But they didn't get to that velocity until they figured out the experience. And so I would say those are the two big areas where people kind of struggle with. It's that experience, setting up that UI layer, the user experience layer, and then making sure that they've got fundamentally correct architecture underneath.
Now, let me double click on that just a little bit. So your first analogy, you talked about user, and you talked about consumer as the user in the iPhone versus Android experience. But then when you start talking about AWS, the user all of a sudden now becomes a developer. So to me, there's still this mindset in a lot of IT shops. It's very much us versus them. And the joke I always make about this is developers don't call it shadow IT; they just call it work.
Right.
Right. So how do you see that? Are IT guys finally starting to see that like speed is more important to developers than anything else, and start as part of the cloud adoption cycle, making it so that they can speed up those iterations and be part of that agile process? Or do you still see some friction there and then wanting to maintain some control and go back to like the pets days of software deployments?
So I think, so let me take a step back and answer that question. So is IT, so are IT still blockers? Yes, in some cases they are. In a lot of cases though, what's been great to see is IT is really on board. They understand that cloud is the future, whether it's public or private or hybrid. They understand that they really need to enable developers in getting that work to market, right? Getting that product to market. And so what we saw with cloud is, the pendulum was on one end where developers had to open tickets and ask IT for resources, et cetera, and it took a long time. Then all of a sudden, with cloud, we swung the pendulum all the way to the other end, and developers were like, "Wait, this is awesome! I'm going out, getting my own instances and stuff." And then like a week goes by, and they're like, "Oh wait, now I've got to wire my EC2 instances to my S3 buckets," and then like, "Oh wait, now I got to figure out VPCs," and then weeks and weeks go by, and then the product owner comes and says, "Hey, why aren't you building features? That's what we're paying you to do." The developer's like, "Oh yeah, gosh, I've spent the last 6 weeks mucking around in cloud, in AWS, trying to figure out how to put these things together." So the pendulum went all the way the other way. And we work with a lot of customers who have, workloads, what we call out in the wild, that are completely unmonitored, unmanaged, and unsecured. And developers have gone out and sort of made a mess, right? And so really you just there's a middle ground there where developers can get the self-service and do the things they want to, but it's secured, and it's a way that we expect them to work. And so I think, if I use the bank analogy, right? Hey, I would love to go to a teller, or sorry, I'd love to get things out of an ATM because I don't have to wait in line for a bank teller and fill out all these things. And yes, an ATM is much more, or even mobile banking it's much more convenient. However, if my identity gets stolen, there's at least some guardrails in place that only $300 or $500 could get taken out of that account, right? And so IT is there to put in sort of those guardrails, right? And while allowing developers to kind of move and work faster. And so we're seeing that now. We're seeing really IT kind of get on board, and how do I become part of the development work stream, as opposed to saying, "Hey, I just need to kind of check these boxes and make sure these things get done because my job is only so big."
Yeah, I'm totally stealing that ATM analogy. So Ali, for the next blog article I turn into you, I'll credit Mr. Willy, but I'm totally stealing that.
I have a quick question. Does you're talking about putting on guardrails? Does that? It sounds like you mean moving workloads on site, or are there ways to have guardrails and still have those workloads in public clouds?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way I talk about guardrails is, you really want to protect the users. I mean, from a technical perspective, you would just think about PCI when we put PCI data into some place versus, our regular data, right? We used to segment PCI data, and we still do to some degree, segment PCI data way out there so we can control how much is audited and contain that, as well as if somebody broke in and tried to get that PCI data, there's a whole different list of security protections around that data, right? When I'm talking about this kind of safeguarding, what I'm really talking about is being part of the process of putting code out to production. So a developer is not going to be thinking about like, how secure is this code? So I'm going to make a caveat here. We are not a security company, Zen Tours. However, we do end up doing a lot in code security. And our thesis is that customers who don't look at this and don't pay attention to code security are the ones who are going to get owned in the next couple of years, right? Because you look at the Equifax breach, that was an Apache Struts vulnerability. Nobody came in through a firewall, right? Forever 21 got breached about 15 years ago. People came in through the search bar, right? Nobody's bashing in through a firewall. People are coming in now through things like malformed containers. So the surface attack areas is much greater. So to think that a developer, or to put the onus of that person like, hey, don't use this package because it's a malformed package. Well, how do they know that? They have to get that information when they're compiling their build. When they're coding, they have to say, hey, you try to use this package. It is a non-signed package. We're not going to allow you to deploy that code. And then the developer can say, oh, okay, here are the packages I can use. Let me use that. That's one of the best packages. If I don't get that feedback, though, within 4 weeks, and I'm onto something else, and I don't get that until security has run a scan in a reactive mode, this is what is really slowing down the pace of production, right? Because I'm not getting that feedback. And so now I've got to figure out, wait, well, my code didn't deploy. I got a ticket back saying, okay, security saying, you have a malformed package, et cetera, versus I got that right away. I made that change, and then I pushed that code to production. And the way we, right now, security to me, the way when we deal with security teams, it's very much like going to the TSA. So, I'm sure you guys take flights. I go to the TSA, to me, it's the worst security experience ever. It's like, oh, you got to take off some of your clothes. We might touch you. It's just bad all around, right? Versus a casino, right? I can go to a casino and I can gamble and I can do whatever I want. But the moment I step out of line, 2 guys in black suits are going to come and escort me off the premises, right? And so my experience was unfettered. As a developer, I was able to go gamble, do my thing, right? But the moment I said, oh, wait, I'm going to break the rules, I was immediately curtailed, right? So, and casino security is far more effective than the TSA. And these are the types of security provisions that need to now go in place for code security.
So you're like this cornucopia of analogies here then. So so your argument then is that security and other aspects that affect a CI/CD tool chain should be more like casino security and less like TSA, if I can.
Yeah, and but by that I mean it should be part of the experience, right? It should not hinder the experience. So when I go to a casino, I'm still having a great experience, but the moment I step out of what they've identified or they've defined as safe behavior, then something gets enacted, right? Versus today, think about IT, I deploy a bunch of things into production, security will run a bunch of reactive scans and things like that and say, hey, wait a minute, there's some things that are broken here. Now they've got to go back and talk to the developers. Did you deploy this? Is this yours? Right? And have that kind of conversation.
Now, what about if you're just at the casino ATM trying to get cab money and your friend comes up to you and says, you're just going to give it all back to them anyway? You shouldn't be there. And no, I swear, I'm just getting cab money.
That's never happened to you, has it?
That didn't happen a week and a half ago, the last time we saw each other. And the other thing about that, just as a comedic aside, did you see that the minimum amount of default withdrawal was $200 on that ATM? Oh,
that's the great thing about finding people on a gambling floor.
I know it went from $200 up to $1,000, and like the suggestion was you want to get 200, right? And I'm just like, no, I just need 40 for the cab tomorrow. I swear.
Wow.
What Pete doesn't tell you is he ended up spending $2,000 that night. So
I did not. I swear. So this was at Partner Connection Week that we last saw each other. So it's funny to me that you make that casino analogy when that's the last place I literally saw you.
It was top of mind, so to speak.
I know, right? Well, now let me ask you. So you talked about this journey from the customer perspective and sort of the 2 tribes within the customer, the developers that are sitting in the line of business teams now, and the IT ops guys that typically take care of the hardware. Now, what about the resellers? It's interesting to me, the business model that you guys have at Zen Tours, that it's very much like teaching people to fish out there in the reseller community. I find in my job in trying to enable the resellers to be able to speak to these cloud products, that a lot of them are uncomfortable getting outside that zone of feeds and speeds and talking to just the person that's going to go plug it in a rack somewhere, that they typically are uncomfortable having that conversation with the developer to talk about, like in the CCP case, to say like, look, do you want to have to continue to go manage your own Kubernetes clusters in the public cloud when your IT guys could do that for you and you get to recoup some of the resources so you can put them back on code? What are you seeing in the reseller community? How comfortable is the reseller community getting with those conversations? And where do you think we are in that journey of sort of expanding the role of that reseller?
We're further behind than we should be. So just to be candid, and you guys know me, so that's kind of where I'm going to go. So with you look at Cisco. Cisco's investing billions of dollars into this transformation. We just came back from Partner Connection Week, and I got to say I was unimpressed with how far the resellers have come, and it's not easy to completely transform your business. It's Cisco is doing what Chuck Robbins sat down and told me was an open heart surgery, right? They are trying to turn a very massive ship. A company, a $200 billion company, is not an easy turn to make, right? You're talking about sort of an aircraft carrier or bigger, right? Trying to make that turn. And so there's a lot of things that we're seeing, in the reseller community. When you make that turn, a couple of things happen there. There's a wake that's created, right? And so Cisco's trying to make this turn without creating a huge wake and wiping out half their partners. They're trying to. It's not enough that Cisco evolves, right, and crosses this sort of river, if you will. They've got to throw a bridge behind them and sort of bring all these other partners along. Because if you think about it, I mean, Cisco, the channel makes up, I believe, above 86% of Cisco's revenue, right? So, and Cisco's been phenomenal at building the channel, and it's been a great strength of theirs. How do we make sure it does not turn into a boat anchor, right?
Yeah.
And that so that you guys can make the turn, and that's really the challenge there. And so I think there's a couple of things that I've seen with the resellers. You're seeing what I'm seeing from the Cisco perspective is this openness to start to engage with other companies, and what Cisco's been great at. Look, Cisco's made a bunch of bonehead moves. That's no secret. But I think what Cisco's been great at is saying, hey, listen, we can't do this by ourselves, right? And we think we need help. We're going to partner with other companies who are pioneers in this space. We're going to allow other companies on our GPL. We are going to start a whole different type of partner community. So we, Zen Tours, are part of a partner community called the DSI, Digital Systems Integrators. And we don't resell. That's not typical for Cisco to partner with a company that doesn't resell their products, right?
Yeah.
So they see value, however, in the consultative approach and the fact that we're able to kind of have and execute on those DevOps, cloud, big data conversations, and then ultimately, help potentially seed some Cisco product through that. So what we're seeing with the resellers, I mean, you look at it, a reseller is a cash. So if you look at what a reseller is, it's a sales organization. They're a cash flow company, right? So they can't take 4 people and put them in a room and say, hey, come out a year later and tell us about your cool product, right? They've got to be able to, within a quarter or two, make a turn and then say, hey, we're getting into this market. Now, when you get into a cloud, big data, DevOps market, you can't just dip your toe into that and say, hey, look, we hired a guy who's really smart at cloud or a gal who's really good at big data, and now we do big data, right? They got to be able to go to market and differentiate. So that takes them about a year or so. And so I built the cloud and DevOps practice for a reseller out in the West Coast, Trace3, right? And we were able to kind of, build that, make it successful. My co-founder, Juan Guevara, built the big data practice out there. And we took it from about 0 to 40 million in under 3 years. So for a $300 million VAR, it's about 10% of their revenue in under 3 years. It was a good kind of leap. We also helped take their services blend from about 5%. So only 5% was services, 95% was hardware. And we grew that to about 20%, which has a bunch of implications across the VAR, right? From different products, different conversations, et cetera. But that's not an easy thing to do for a VAR, right? That VAR really had to sit down, invest, and make a gut change, because you've got a number of salespeople in that company that are making money by going to kind of what I call the old watering hole, which is quickly drying up, which is sort of the hardware, software slinging.
Go back 3 years later, sell them the latest gear that's got the new features, and if you've got a big enough patch of relationships in, whatever geography, like you're sitting in Colorado, if your geo is Colorado and you've got like 25 companies, divvy it up into groups of 4 and visit one every, you keep going back and forth and cycling through that. It's a different sales model now.
Yeah, absolutely. And what VARs have been used to is their supplier, like a Cisco, would take them in and say, hey, we're Cisco. This is our VAR with us. We're going to sell you these products. Cisco or the supplier might do the majority of the sale. Maybe the VAR did some of the sale. And then the product got sold through. That's not what's happening today, right? Customers don't need that help. They can go directly to the vendor. They're far more informed and educated. They know in many cases a lot more about the product than the VAR or sometimes even the vendor does.
Yeah.
So when you come to the table, what they're asking for is, how does this fit into my greater initiative, right? And how do these sets of products kind of help me enable my vision, or how do they compare against these other products? And so that traditional way of selling is quickly dying out. What really is evolving now is this more consultative-led sell, where you can come in and say, okay, I get it. You've got a number of these products. You're this far in the journey, because customers are not just starting their cloud journey anymore, or their DevOps journey. They're a good couple of years in. And so how do I accelerate you? And that's really what we do for customers, right? A lot of these customers they're fairly smart, they're fairly intuitive. But what might take them, 2 or 3 years to do, we're going to help them do in about 6 or 7 months.
So that's more, you talk about the consultative selling, and it's much more focused on business outcomes than, can I sell you the latest, greatest router and switch, right? And have you found, because we've had this part of this conversation before, have you found that it continues to be, you have to invest some more work up front and with a different audience, but that the long-term payoff becomes better because the margins on software is better? Are you still finding that, or has that dynamic changed?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two things. One is just the sales cycle. So let's just talk about, we'll get really concrete on that. We did a big 3-letter media company in the West Coast. There's a few of those. So, when we were kind of selling them or building their private cloud initiative for them, we had to speak to 26 different teams, right? Go. And imagine that from a salesperson's perspective, right? A salesperson is playing a quarter-by-quarter game. They have a quota that they have to meet. And so if they've got to meet 26 teams just before they can get that initial yes or no, even from a customer, they're not going to do that. And we see this over and over again. So we can enable salespeople all day long. We can send them to training and teach them, like, this is cloud and here's why it's important. But when they're going through that sales cycle and all of a sudden their IT director says, you know what, that's no longer my decision. That's the compute and virtualization team, and you need to talk to them. The compute and virtualization team says, no, you got to talk to the database team, but we're not going to introduce you to them, right? And all of a sudden the salesperson sees their prospects like, I'm not going to be able to help this customer, right, is what they think. And so they say, look, I'm just going to go back down for that storage refresh or that server refresh. So how do you really stitch that conversation through with the customer, right? And so that's really the biggest thing we see, is that limiter.
Right, and if I'm the customer, what I want to know, because customers, you figure, are listening to this right now, is how do I overcome that kind of built-in problem? The fact that right now, yes, in order to fix this, it's going to take 26 meetings. Oh my gosh, how do I get this person in who's going to consult, help us accelerate our adoption? So I guess that's just an interesting point for anyone listening to consider is, they're trying to fix it. What?
It's alignment, right? That's kind of what we've talked about before. It's an alignment problem, and as the salesperson, you're kind of playing the role of like therapist, right? And trying to get the different parts of the family together.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly a therapy session. And actually we have therapy sessions. We call them workshops though. And we bring different groups of the customer. And so we did that one for that media company. And the day before, the VP of applications called us and said, hey, can you uninvite the network team? We said, no, we don't know how to do that, first of all. But secondly, we had to have a conversation like, well, why would we want to do that? And they said, well, the network team, they just get in the way of everything. It takes so long to get through their processes, blah, blah, blah. And they're just going to stop this whole thing. And we said, do you think you can build this private cloud initiative without the network? And the app said, well, no, of course not. So we said, all right. We brought the network team to the table. And then in that session, we were able to find out why the network team was creating such a kind of a pushback on a lot of things and solve for some of those problems. And so, we did another workshop in Colorado where the VP of IT said, no, the devs get everything as fast as possible. We spin up VMs faster than they can consume them. Someone was in that workshop, a dev texted his VP. That VP of apps came in, pointed at the VP of IT and said, I don't know if we can swear on this podcast, but swore at him and said, hey, say that again. And the VP of IT went red and said, well, what are you talking about? And they started to get into it. The VP of Apps said, no, I know you think you guys spin up these VMs, but it takes my guys 2 weeks before the network's open, another 2 weeks before the data's there, another 2 weeks before the security guys open it so I can get it from outside. And they started fighting. And so this is really what's happening within these customers' environments. It's an alignment issue, right? As Pete was mentioning. And so for the reseller has to figure out, hey, how do I align these folks around something? Because if the leaders aren't aligned, if they're not in agreement, everybody else is left to fight bloody, unwinnable battles, right? And what you see, especially in these bigger engagements, and the bigger companies, VMware has aligned themselves with the virtualization team, so that's potentially what they're pushing. Cisco's done a great job on the networking side and aligned themselves there, so the network team is pushing something potentially different. And then Oracle has done a great job, aligning with sort of their data folks. And so you've got 3 VPs now who are both saying, or all 3 are saying, nope, we need to build a private cloud initiative. But one is saying we need to build it the VMware way, one is saying the Cisco way, one is saying the Oracle way. Really what the customer needs is to build it in their way. Right, just like we talked about, how do I create that enterprise experience for myself? Right, I'm a media company. I want to create this type of experience, and you kind of brought this up earlier, Pete. You were saying, hey, look, I've got now users who are using cloud. I've got IT. I've got dev, and truly, what it comes to, when you look at a cloud in an enterprise, you will actually have a stratification of menus. Right, just like when we go to fast food, what we're buying from is burgers, fries, and shakes. That's what we see. That's our menu, and we're the end user. But the people who are potentially, cooking it, or the manager of the store, the menu that they're buying from is a different menu. They're buying, pounds of potatoes and pounds of meat and pounds of tomatoes and things like that. And so they have a different menu. So it's how do you kind of construct that experience for that customer and for the different users of that cloud platform?
So that you get the right menu to the right audience, right?
Right.
That's right. Exactly. And what I'm curious about is, were you able to solve that problem? Like, where you went in there and they didn't want to bring the network team in?
Yeah, and so here's how we solve this problem. We don't try to bite the whole elephant. Like so the old way of solving this problem, and by the way, I tried this before, and the only reason I know this is because I failed so miserably at this a couple of times before we figured it out at that pharmaceutical company. The old way we used to do it is, hey, let's go and gather all the requirements, right? And we had hired a big 5 consulting shop to come and do that, and we had been failing at this cloud initiative internally. This is when I was on the customer side at this pharmaceutical company. And this consulting company said, hey, let's go and interview all your business units and figure out what they wanted. And they came back and they said, hey, you need to build these 300 services. And look, at the face of that, that's the wrong thing to do. And Pete's heard me say this. I don't go to a restaurant because it's got the most items on the menu, right? Like, wow, Cheesecake Factory, they added 2 more pages. Let's go over there, Pete. Like, that's not happening, right? It's the experience. Like, am I going for a fine dining experience, a fast food experience, et cetera? And for an enterprise, that's super important to cultivate. You really have to figure out, if I'm a media company, or if I'm a retail company, like, what is the experience that my consumers want? And you focus on that. Because all that other stuff below is going to change, right? Yeah. It might be AWS one day, it might be Azure one day, it might be Cloud Center, and then Cisco finds, the newer product that comes out later. And so those things will change. But if you focused on the top layer, which is the experience, and you make sure that you've cultivated and you understand your user experience, it doesn't matter if the products underneath are going to change and you move from Docker to Kubernetes, right? The developer experience should still be the same.
So when you had that big 5 consulting firm come in and they got this list of 300 services, did you guys actually pursue that, or you went a different direction?
We started to pursue it. I think the cost kind of, we saw that, and we also realized, like, this is not going to work. The way we pursued it was we picked just like a VC picks a portfolio, actually. We picked a couple of services. We picked 4 or 5 services, and we said, okay, we're going to go to market with this. And so this is how we work with customers. We don't try to, let's go gather all your requirements. And thank you, Ali, for jogging me along here. We actually, we pick 1 or 2 use cases, and we say, what would really move the needle for you? Is it instant VM delivery? One that we build is instant developer environments. That's one that comes up a lot. Developers don't want servers. The moment they get servers, they start putting things on them. Like they purpose it, right? They put Linux on it, and they'll put RPMs and packages and so forth, and turn it into something. I would rather have an application blueprint where I've got, my 3 or 4 servers with all my services kind of knit together so I can start contributing code. That's what I want. And so that's an instant developer environment. And so whatever that use case is, we figure that out, because that one use case will drive everything else. It will drive the experience, it will drive the architecture, it'll drive the platform. Just like Amazon started out with, S3, 4 years later, EC2. And then now you're managing a service portfolio, and that's a very different thing, because now I'm not gulping down requests from every business unit and saying like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get to this? It's just more and more and more tickets. Well, I'm more in a proactive mode where I can say, hey, 2018, here's the 5 services we're releasing.
Yeah,
and
it relates to these business outcomes that we want, right?
Right. And these are the business units that said they want it. And somebody says, hey, that service in Q4, I need it in Q3. That's easy. That's a trade-off conversation.
Yeah.
Right. And so then I'm managing a service portfolio. And the great thing about a service portfolio is, so you'll launch like 5 services, let's say. 2 will work out of the gate, and that's great. 2 will fail and die right away. And that's actually good too, if they die right away. The worst are what at the VC we used to call the living dead, which, a few people use it, but not enough, but you can't get rid of it now because you've got a couple of teams on it, but, not enough to kind of really scale it. And if you think at a VC, this is what would happen. There's a few companies in the portfolio who would make it, a few that would die. The ones that were really scary, the ones who would keep coming in and say, I just need a little more money to get over this next round, and if you just keep investing, we'll eventually make it. You really want those ones to go away. So.
Right. And I'm sure that with the services you launch, the ones that have a few users are probably really passionate users.
Yeah. And then what you see is, so this is the adoption thing. So aside, my 2 biggest failures, as I mentioned earlier, or maybe before we were recording on the podcast, were alignment, getting everybody to sort of agree to like, this is what we're going to do. And to try to get everybody to agree on this big strategy, is a little bit difficult versus, hey, can we agree on this use case? Like, yeah, instant developer environments, I get that, right? So then I get away from these arguments of, hey, should it be VMware or OpenStack or Docker or Kubernetes? Be like, no, let's not worry about those yet. Let's figure out, hey, is this what the experience that you want? Is this the outcome you want? Yeah, is this how you want that workflow to go? And once you've aligned there, then the product conversation becomes much easier, right? And so I don't get into these sort of turf wars. And then once you deliver that outcome or that use case, then when you've got 3 or 4 teams using it and they're like, wow, this is great, they then become the biggest sort of proponents and promoters of that. And a service, you have to promote a service. That's another, part of the adoption is actually driving the service. How do people know about Amazon or Cisco? It's not because they got an email one day, right? You guys have a full campaign going on. Hey, here's a new product. You've got people training resellers down to technical people. You've got these podcasts. And so internally, a customer needs to actually do those types of things. And we call it out rolling out. The first sort of phase of that is rolling out what we call concierge services, where people will actually handhold you through the services and get you to use them. And then once you get through that initial hump of adoption, you can drive further and further adoption.
That makes sense. Hey, I don't want to cut this conversation off, but we are running out of time. I imagine you have, both of you have other places to go. We're at the top of the hour. So, Pete, did you have any last question you need to squeak in before we're done here?
No, what struck me when he was talking about the, some big requirements list, like 17 years in HPIT, I'm certainly no stranger to like some, big old Excel spreadsheet with weighted criteria, and you get some 4-digit number at the end that you're supposed to try to weigh different things against. I guess if I was to summarize all that, I know it sounds like you're saying if you start with the RFI, you've already lost, right? You should start with what the outcomes are.
Yeah, and start with one simple use case and figure out what the experience is and the architecture you want to drive out of that. And from there, you can start to piece together an actionable strategy that you can drive alignment with.
Well, and it sounded like you said, okay, you launch 5 services one year, 2 fail, 2 make it, 1's in the middle. Next year, do you launch another 5 services?
Yeah, in fact, your velocity will grow. So one company we did, I think we started them last November. They were launching 4 services. They're up to 17 services now in 8 months. A
few years, you've got a portfolio. You've got a full portfolio of services.
You got a full portfolio of services, and then you become the cloud service provider of choice. right? And that's what you want in an enterprise. Whether if someone's going out to AWS behind or Azure or whatever, you are the cloud service provider of choice. So everything is kind of getting brokered through your platform.
Nice. That is a nice way to end it. Well, I want to thank you for being on the show today. I appreciate your time and you sharing a point of view that we definitely have not been hearing much of, if at all. So I really appreciate you representing kind of the consultants out there and the adoption curves and things like that. Pete, thank you for joining me as co-host today. I really appreciate it. And oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I just wanted to say thank you. Sorry.
Sure. And I hope you'll come back. I hope in a few months or a year or so we can have you back and you can update us a little bit more about what you're seeing and how folks are moving along the adoption curve.
All right, thank you, Ali, Pete. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Anoj. Bye-bye.